Oil lamps are really important for the time period. In the 18th century, yes, they had candles, and candles were used a lot. But candles are expensive, especially nice beeswax candles. The kind of candles that we would use today are just amazingly nice compared to the candles they had in the 18th century. Candles were both expensive and they didn't work nearly as well as the candles that we have today. One of the things that we take for granted is the simple candle wicks that we have in our candles today that bend over nicely and do the perfect candle wick thing where you don't have to sit there and fuss with the candle wick all the time. In the 18th century, that wasn't true. That simple technology of braiding the candle wick so that it would bend over like that is a 19th century invention. So one of the great things to use in the time period was an oil lamp. It used a very inexpensive fuel, probably something that you had lying around in your kitchen, waste grease and oils from the kitchen and from cooking or other types of oils would work in a simple oil lamp. Very inexpensive, and you didn't have to fight them quite as much as some kinds of candles. So oil lamps were very, very common and popular. But the oil's messy. It can really get away from you. Most of the oil lamps in the time period were an open vessel like this. You had to be very careful with it. It was going to spill its oil. Some of the lamps were extremely simple. They were basically just a bowl, possibly a bowl with just a little kind of a spout on it to hold the wick out. And here's an example of something like that I turned the other day. Just a simple little bowl on a stand with a little spout so that the wick can stick up there. And as the wick would burn down, you'd have a little piece of wire and you'd slowly move that up, and you could make it a little brighter. Maybe it would be smokier, but you could get a little bit more light. But you were always fighting it. And the real problem with a super simple design like this is that oil is constantly moving up the wick, and it will drip off the edge of this little lamp, and it will cause a mess. So some of these lamps would have an extra little chamber down here, or a little lip that would catch the excess oil as it would drip off, and it would be just nasty and messy. Our ceramic lamp is similar to metal versions in the time period. So here is an iron Betty lamp of the 18th century, one of the ones that we sell. This is a similar sort of design, an open tray here, and inside it is this little sort of half tube for our wick to flow up. But the great little idea and the design that makes this so much better than a standard one where, again, just a lip and that the wick would hang off of it is, as the oil moves up this wick, the little trough that's holding this wick is separated from the edge of the metal, so that the oil goes up and will fall back down directly back into where all the oil is. Much, much cleaner, a much better design. So that's what we want to make today, an oil lamp that the oil doesn't get away. It goes up the wick, and then the excess just flows back down into the reservoir with all the rest of the oil. So that's what we're going to be making, and this is based off of an early 19th century example found in a museum, I think down in North Carolina. We're going to be making a vessel. The first stage of this vessel is making this sort of open bowl on a little stand here. And this is the one we'll be using later on as we move on to the next stages. But let's get one of these made up. And it is a pretty simple piece to make up. There are a couple little tricks to it that we have to be careful of. Let's get this centered up. Now that our ball is centered, we have to get to this stage. And one of the things that I like about making it like this is we want a kind of a heavy base. This item, again, is something we don't want it to tip over on the table. It's on fire, it's full of liquid and nasty oil. So we want this to be a very stable item. So we want it to have a large and heavy, stable base. Can't be too heavy or else it won't dry properly. But what we're gonna do here is start off with the base. And I'm just going to take a spot here where I think is about the right thickness, and we're just going to start to collar that in. We haven't worried about this top at all yet, or this, the center part. Now, we can go about this two different ways. We could do this in two pieces, and it's likely if I was going to be making one that was very fancy, well, I mean, some of these were taller, maybe 8 inches tall or something like that, we would make it in two different pieces. We would make the stem, and then we would make the upper part and then put them together. Because you can't turn something kind of big on top of this tiny little stem of clay and expect that to work. So this we're going to be making in just one piece, so we're going to leave the stem of it pretty stout because we need the strength of that as we turn this upper part. We've got a lot of clay up here, and we just gonna have to get rid of some of it, especially any of it that's out of round. We can see some out of roundness here, and it's going to be a lot easier for us if we just cut that off. Just take that away. And we want to get this sort of bowl shape up here. And this is one of those circumstances where if you don't have the right amount of material up here, there's nothing you can do. You can make it thinner and thinner, but I don't want it to be too thin. This is going to have some possible heat to it. The tube that we're going to be adding later on is really going to be where most of the heat is, but we want it to not be so thin that a little bit of heat will cause it to crack and break. We still certainly have some issues here with out of roundness. Didn't get that ball centered quite as well as I should have. But we can correct that as we go. You can definitely see it going very eccentric here on us, but we can fix that up. There we go. So let me just get this normalized here. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of a kind of a lip on that, so we don't want that oil to get away from us. Smooth that up. That's pretty simple. We can we can now fuss with this lower section if we wanted to, use our tools and create some, fancy lumps and bumps in it, as the case were. That's, let me go ahead and flatten this base out. We could skinny it up just a touch right now and possibly get some height out of it. But that's can be a dangerous thing to do at this point. That's about right. Give it a interesting little look here. We could even create an extra little catching chamber down here in the bottom, but since we're going to be making this hopefully right up at the top, we don't really need to do that. You will definitely find lamps that are of this type of design where there's just a sort of a little bowl up on a stem and it just has a little lip, and this whole lower section is made to catch the extra oil, so it will have a big lip sticking up on it. Since we don't need to do that on this one, we can just make a nicely designed little bottom without any of those crazy things going on. There we go. Nice, simple, elegant design down there. And we are just going to cut this off the wheel. So this is going to have to get to a leather hard state, and the fix that up a little bit. Once it's still leather hard, we can start to do the constructing of the other parts on this. And so I've got a couple of these already made up. But the trick about this also is this is a very heavy base on this, and this whole internal stem here is solid. This will take forever to dry, and it's quite likely that it will crack. So this really should be hollowed out. And we can do that after the fact. Once we have this in its leather hard state, I'll use this one as the example. We're going to come in here and with something as simple as a drill bit, and we can come in and just drill a hole. We don't want it to go anywhere. We certainly don't want it to go through the top, but we can just drill into that like that. Maybe even grab something a little bigger. We can take a tool. This is still just slightly soft, but we need to come in here and make that hollow so that it can dry out properly. So air can get all the way up in there and the moisture gets all the way out. This either would take forever to dry if we didn't do that, and if it doesn't get totally dry, then when we fire it, it will explode. That moisture in there will, when it gets to about 300 degrees or so, that'll start to boil and create an internal steam pressure and just explode the piece into bits. And you'll open up your kiln the next day and there you just have a bunch of shards of pieces. So you'll definitely will need to drill holes in something that's thick like this, or just let it dry forever. And nobody wants to do that. So it needs to be hollowed out like that so it can dry properly. So the next trick now is assembling the part that has this little tube here that holds the wick. And this, we've got two issues, and that is it should be connected not at the very edge, or else the oil will go down the outside, which we don't want to happen. But it should be mostly suspended from at least the midway point or from the very end if possible. If it's just done from the very end though, it's likely that it would just break. So we do need sort of a midway support on this. But what we need to do now is make a tube. And we make a tube with pottery with an extrusion press. And yeah, they used extruders to make ribbons of clay for handles. And in this case, a tube of clay will be pressed out. And so I'm gonna go over, we're gonna squeeze out a tube of clay and come back and start to put this together. So let's assemble the rest. This has been drying overnight. It's leather hard. It's enough that we can work with it without it deforming on us, which is good. We've got our piece of extruded clay tubing, and this is something that most potters would have that kind of tool available to them. They would have a simple extrusion press. It might not be a big one that hangs on the wall like ours, but a simple wooden affair. Basically, you know, a little plunger, outer cylinder, a little plunger tube on the middle, and then little plates to fit on the front of it to squeeze out the different shapes. Just like a Play-Doh machine or the little machines that you use to squeeze out those Christmas cookies in different kinds of shapes. It does take a little bit of a special plate in the end so that it can squeeze out a tube, but again, that's nothing that's too difficult. You can make that tube sort of by hand if you want, you know, squeezing the clay out until it's just a thin sheet and then rolling it over and making a tube. But it's so much easier when you've got the little extruder machine. You can just extrude out our tube. So I'm gonna cut off a little piece here that's, about an inch long or so. And we're just gonna cut it like we would any other piece of clay. We just got a needle here in our cork, and we're gonna cut that off. Now, of course, it's gonna wanna collapse a little bit, but that's all right. This is clay and it's very easy to manipulate. It almost looks like it's closed up, but it's not. Just take that little, and there you can see it's just a little tube now. I'm gonna smooth it off a little bit. And I want to make this easy to connect on the inside, so I'm going to split it and open it up a little bit. So we're going to split it the last quarter or so. Take that, sort of open it up. We want it to be easy to get that wick in to the bottom edge of it. Make sure that our little spout is still good. And I'm going to go ahead and place a little bit of clay here on the bottom edge so that it's got a good stout connector and it doesn't break off easily. So let me just set this down for a second. Just cut another piece of clay that's the same strength. So just another piece of that same tube. Just open that up. I'm just gonna roll it into a little support. Stick it to the bottom, because we just want to make sure that tube doesn't lay all the way down into that. And that looks like it will work. We want it to be a little higher than the outside rim. But again, we want it to stay away from that very edge. So I think that kind of placement right there, you can kind of see it there, will be good. Now all I have to do is get that fastened in there without sticking it down in the wrong way. Let me mark that. Just kind of do a preliminary placement. So there we go. Since this is leather hard, we're going to scratch that surface so that the clay can bind properly. There we go. So we're sort of opening up. We don't want that outer, very, very dry layer to not adhere. So if we cut down into it with our little needle, it'll get down into slightly softer clay underneath. Then we just take a little bit of this super soft clay. It's right on the outside edge of our water. I'm always cleaning off my hands, getting this, sort of clay slime off my hands. That clay slime is perfect. It's the perfect glue. So I'm going to take that same stuff and put it right over our hatch marks. There we go. And we just extruded this clay, so it's a little soft, but that means we don't have to work it as hard as we do that leather hard clay. So we're going to place that about where we want it, and then smooth this softer clay down right onto our hatch marks, onto our little slime clay and whatnot. And it has that little bit. Now we can get really close to that edge. We just don't want to get so close that a drip of oil will be able to reach over the edge. That's all right. I'm just going to make sure that doesn't. So we got almost 1/4 inch of gap. That's perfect. We want it to look nice. We want it to be strong enough that it won't break off. And there it is. So we also need to make sure that the hole where the wick goes is totally good and not clogged up. If it is, this clay is still very soft. We can open that hole up if we need to, and we can even wait till this is dry and very, very carefully, before this is fired, very, very carefully go in there and sort of file away that dried clay if it was in the way, but this looks actually very good. So there it is. Now, this has got a nice big reservoir now. Plenty of oil can be in our lamp. This little spot, this little tube will be perfect for holding that wick up and out. And it's made in such a way that we don't have to worry about that oil going over the edge and making a horrible mess all over our table and wasting the oil. We don't want to do that. So we've got this, all this has to do now is dry. It'll get glazed up. Again, we have this very, very heavy solid base and thick cylinder that's holding that up. This will have to be drilled out. It's a little soft still, but again, drilled out so that can dry properly. But it's got a nice heavy weight to it, something that won't easily get knocked over. Even if someone brushes against it, there's going to be enough weight there that it won't knock over easily. The last thing we want to happen with our open flame on the table. Well, there we have our final piece. It's going to get dried. We'll glaze it, we'll fire this guy up, and it will be ready to go on the table. And I'm excited to try this one out because this was a little bit different design. I decided to go a little bit bigger with this, and I want to see how this one works out. If we wanted to, we could even put a handle on it like some of those, but I kind of like the look of it without the handle. So we will go ahead and drill the bottom of it out like this one, maybe even a little bit bigger so that it dries out, doesn't explode in the kiln, all that. But when it's done, it should work exactly like this one. Such a simple method of lighting with inexpensive materials, inexpensive fuel. The wick is just any old piece of fabric that you have left over that you can use in there. So it's a great little lighting device that would have been used on the tables of not only people in the 18th century, the 19th century, or earlier in the 17th century, but lamps like this used for thousands of years. So it's a great, fun little project, and we don't even think about it for a second today. how important a lighting device like this would it be to people back in history.